The morning the trailer came up my lane, it was the second Tuesday of November, 2019, and the sky was the color of old tin, that flat gray. That means the cold is settled in and not going anywhere. I remember I had my coffee going lukewarm on the porch rail because I'd been standing out there watching the county road since before 6, waiting on a man I'd only spoken to on the telephone twice. The frost had come hard the week before, and the pastures were stiff and silvered when the sun caught them, though the sun wasn't doing much that day. I was 68 that fall, and I'd worked this same ground north of the river for the better part of 40 years, and I will tell you, honestly, I did not know, standing there with my cold coffee, what I was really getting into. I only knew that 9 old bison were coming down that lane in a stock trailer with a bad taillight, and that nobody else in 3 counties had wanted them. They were culls. That's the plain word for it, and I won't dress it up. 9 cows past their breeding years, the youngest of them 10, and the oldest closer to 14 animals. A big operation 200 miles west of me had decided weren't worth the hay they'd eat through a winter. The man hauling them, a broker who dealt mostly in what he called salvage stock, told me on the phone he'd take $300 a head just to be rid of them before the snow, and that if I didn't take them, they were headed to a processor who'd give him less. $2,700 for 9 bison nobody wanted. My wife, Ruth, when I told her the number, didn't say anything for a good long while. She was at the sink with her hands in the dishwater, and she just looked out the window at the north pasture, and then she asked me the only question that mattered to her, which was, how many acres were we talking about feeding them on through the spring? 40, I told her. The rough 40 on the north side, the piece with the seep in it that never did grow much of anything worth cutting. She dried her hands and said, well, they're your bison? And that was as close to a blessing as I was going to get, and it was enough. Now, I want to be honest about my reasons, because a man my age taking on 9 geriatric bison in November looks like sentiment, and sentiment is a thing people around here forgive but do not respect. The neighbor down the road, a fellow named Dell, who runs cow-calf pairs on good bottom ground and keeps his truck cleaner than most men keep their kitchens, came by 2 days after the trailer left. He didn't get out. He rolled his window down and idled there at my fence line with the heater going, and he looked out at those 9 big dark shapes standing in the frost, and he asked me, polite as could be, what I thought I was going to do with 9 old cows that couldn't calve on 40 acres of ground that grew mostly rushes. It was a fair question, and he asked it fairly. Dell's not a cruel man, the certain man, which is different, and around here the certain men do most of the talking. I told him I was wintering them. He nodded slow, the way you nod at a fellow you've decided to feel a little sorry for, and he said, the feed alone would eat me alive by February, and that if I wanted meat, there were cheaper ways to get it, and if I wanted company, there were cheaper animals for that too. Then he rolled his window up and drove on, and I stood at the fence, a while after his truck was gone. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and by the time it got back around to me, the version had grown, the way they do. I'd paid $500 a head, somebody said. I'd bought a whole herd. I'd gone soft in the head since Ruth's brother passed. I let it go. You learn, farming as long as I have, which fights the land, will let you win, and which ones are just noise, and gossip is noise. But here's the thing. I didn't tell Dell, and didn't tell the diner, because I wasn't ready to say it out loud and risk being wrong. My grandfather ran bison on this same North 40, back before the war, back when nobody around here ran bison at all, and he left me a reason I'd been carrying in the back of my mind for the better part of 50 years without ever quite understanding it. When I was a boy, maybe 8 or 9, he had taken me out to that rough 40 on a January morning, colder than the one those culls arrived on, and he'd shown me something and told me to remember it. And I had, in that half-buried way. A child remembers things without knowing why. I didn't know yet what those old bison knew. I only knew my grandfather had trusted. That piece of ground with animals everyone told him were foolish, and that he'd never once in all the years I knew him lost stock on it through a winter, and that when he sold out of bison in his old age, it wasn't because the ground failed him. It was because the market went one way, and he went another, the way old men do. So when the broker called about 9 culls, nobody wanted something in me that had been quiet for 50 years, sat up and paid attention. I want to be clear that I didn't have a plan. I had a memory and a piece of ground, and $2,700 I could stand to lose. And I had the beginnings of a feeling that the ground I'd been apologizing for my whole adult life, the rough 40, with the seep that wouldn't grow hay, might have been the most valuable piece I owned all along, and that my grandfather had known it, and that I'd been too busy farming the easy ground to listen. The first week I just watched them. That's most of what I did those first several days, if I'm honest. I'd carry hay out morning and evening. Good grass hay I'd put up myself, off the bottom ground, and I'd set it out, and then I'd stand back and watch 9 old bison decide what they thought of my 40 acres. They came off that trailer stiff and slow and suspicious, the way old animals move, and for the first 2 days they stayed bunched up near the corner where I'd unloaded them, not trusting the space. But by the 3rd or 4th day, they'd begun to move. And here is the part I paid attention to, because I'd been raised by a man who taught me that animals will tell you things about ground that no soil test ever will, if you only shut up long enough to watch. They didn't spread out, even across the 40. They didn't graze it like cattle would, working the good grass first and drifting. They went, all 9 of them, over the low rise in the middle of the 40 and down into the seep, the wet low ground I'd always cursed. And they stood there, not grazing. There wasn't much to graze, just standing down in the low spot where the ground stayed soft, where in a normal year the water pooled and the rushes grew, and I lost a mower blade every 3rd season trying to cut around it. They'd wander up to the hay and eat, and then they'd drift back down to that seep and stand in it, and by the end of that first week, I'd noticed something I couldn't explain, which was that the seep, in the coldest part of the 40, and weather cold enough now to skin over every stock tank on the place with a ½ inch of ice by morning. The seep wasn't freezing. There was a patch down there, maybe 30 feet across, where the ground stayed dark and wet and open, while everything around it went white and hard. And those 9 old bison stood in it like they'd come home. I like to tell you I understood it right off, but I didn't. I told myself it was just the bison's body heat, 9 big animals, bedding in one spot, churning the mud, keeping it open. That's what a reasonable man tells himself, and I am mostly a reasonable man. But it nagged at me, because the patch stayed open even in the early morning, before they'd have been down there long, and because it was warmer than churned mud has any right to be. So, one morning near the end of that first week, before the sun was fully up, when the thermometer on my porch read 11 degrees, I walked out to the seep, and I knelt down at the edge of that open patch, and I put my bare hand flat against the wet ground, and it was not cold. It was cool, the way a cellar is cool, but it was not the killing cold of the air, and there was the faintest give of warmth to it, a warmth that had no business being there in 11-degree weather with the whole world frozen hard around it. I knelt there a long time, with my hand on that ground and my breath smoking in the air, and the oldest of the cows, a big scarred thing I'd taken to calling, the elder because she led the others everywhere, stood 10 feet off and watched me, with those dark eyes bison have, patient and ancient, like she'd been waiting for me to catch up. And I remembered all at once and complete the January morning 60 years before, when my grandfather had knelt in that same spot and put my small hand on that same ground and said to me, "Water below here, warm, all winter," and told me to remember it. And I had. I just never understood it until 9 old bison nobody wanted came and stood on it and showed me what it was for. That evening I went out to the machine shed, and I climbed up into the loft where my grandfather's things had sat under a canvas tarp since my father passed and never got sorted. I'm not a man who goes rooting through the past. Ruth will tell you I let dead men's boxes sit longer than I ought to, and she's right, and I'll own that. But that night I went up with a flashlight because I was looking for one particular thing. A ledger I half remembered from when I was a boy. A marbled composition book my grandfather kept his ground notes in. And I found it in a wooden crate under an old harness gone stiff as iron. The cover was that black and white marble pattern gone soft at the corners, and the pages inside were filled edge to edge with his careful pencil hand, gone brown now with the years. Notes on rainfall and calving dates and hay yields going back to the 1930 seconds. I sat down on an overturned bucket in that cold loft, and I read by flashlight for close to 2 hours, and most of it was the plain daily accounting of a man's working life. But near the back, in an entry dated the winter of 1951, I found the thing I'd climbed up there, hoping and half afraid to find. He'd written, in that same careful hand, "North Sea runs open all winter," and then below it, "Warm water below." And then a line he'd underlined twice, so hard the pencil had near torn the paper, and that line said, "Never freezes where the spring comes up." And then, off to the side circled, with a question mark he'd never answered. 3 words, "How deep?" How deep, with a question mark, circled. Sitting there on the page for 68 years, waiting on somebody to answer it. I put the notebook back in the crate, because I wasn't ready. I'll be honest about that. I climbed down out of that loft, and I did chores, and I ate my supper, and I said nothing to Ruth, because there are questions a man has to sit with a while before he goes looking for the answer, and this was one of them. My grandfather had known there was warm water coming up under that rough 40. He'd known it in 1951, and likely long before. And he'd never dug. Never dug the way you don't dig a thing you're afraid to be wrong about, or the way you don't dig when the ground is giving you what you need already and you leave well enough alone. But he'd wanted to know how deep, and he'd died not knowing. And now 9 old Bison had stood on the spot and reopened the whole question, and I lay awake that night with 3 underlined words and a circle question turning over in the dark, 68 years after he wrote it. The cold deepened all that December, the way it does, and I settled into a rhythm with the Bison and with the question I hadn't yet decided to answer. Every morning I'd carry hay, and every morning I'd find them down in the seep, standing in that open patch of dark wet ground, and every morning I'd kneel and put my hand to the earth and feel that cellar-cool warmth that would not freeze. I began to keep my own notes in the back of the same marbled book, taking up where my grandfather had left off 68 years before, which felt like a strange kind of prayer. I noted the air temperature and the size of the open patch and how the Bison used it. And I noticed a thing that no book had taught me and that I'd never have seen without those animals to teach me. The open patch was not random. It had a center, a spot maybe 8 feet across, where the ground stayed warmest and the Bison bedded thickest, and from that center, the warmth spread out and faded, the way warmth does from a source. The spring, if that's what it was, came up in one particular place, and the Bison had found the center of it with their bodies before I'd found it with my hand. They pay attention. That's the whole of it. They pay attention in a way we've mostly forgotten how to, and they'd read that 40 acres of frozen ground and gone straight to the one warm heart of it, like water finding a low place. Around the middle of the month, I finally told Ruth. I told her about the notebook and the underlined line and the circled question, and I told her what I felt under my hand every morning, and she listened the whole way through without saying a word, which is her way. And when I was done, she asked me the practical thing. She asked what warm water coming up under our North 40 was worth, and I told her I didn't know, and she said then maybe it was time I found out, and that was Ruth giving me permission to do the thing I'd been afraid to do, which was go dig where my grandfather never had. But I didn't dig, not yet. I want to be honest about my hesitations because they're the truest part of this. A man doesn't call in an excavator on a whim in the dead of winter to chase a feeling and a dead man's note. So I did the thing I do, which is I went slow, and I gathered evidence. In early January, I drove into the county seat to the Water and Soil office, and I talked to the extension fellow there a young man in a clean Carhartt jacket with a clipboard and a laptop. Decent enough and well-meaning, and I told him I thought I might have a warm spring coming up on my north ground. He was patient with me. He pulled up the groundwater survey maps for my section on his screen, and he studied them, and he told me kindly that there was no recorded spring anywhere on my property, that the water table in my part of the county sat at around 90 feet, and that whatever I was feeling was almost certainly just decomposing organic matter in a wet seep, which can generate a little heat, and that I shouldn't spend real money chasing it. He gave me a number. He said drilling a test well to prove out a spring would run me $8,000 to $12,000, and that for a warm patch of mud, that was money I'd never see again. That was the number designed to end the conversation, and I've heard enough of those in my life to know one when it lands. He wasn't wrong to say it. By everything on his screen, he was right. But he'd never knelt on that ground with his hand flat against it at 11 degrees. And he'd never watched 9 old animals that had every reason to bunch up and shiver, instead walk straight to one warm spot and stand in it like they knew something the maps didn't. Decomposing organic matter doesn't hold at cellar cool through a 2-week hard freeze. I thanked him, and I took his number, and I drove home. And the whole way home I heard my grandfather's underlined line, "Never freezes where the spring comes up." And I made up my mind that I'd answer his question for him even if the extension fellow's map said there was nothing to answer. Now the thing about winter is it decides a lot of things for you. And it decided that I wasn't going to be digging anything in January with the ground frozen 4 feet down everywhere except that one patch. So I waited, and the waiting was its own kind of work. I kept the bison fed, and I kept my notes, and I kept kneeling on that ground. And somewhere in that long, cold waiting, I stopped thinking of those 9 culls as a foolish purchase and started thinking of them as the smartest thing I'd done in a decade. They came through the worst of that winter better than they had any right to. There were nights that dropped to 15 below, nights that killed the neighbor's calf and cracked stock tanks all over the county, and every one of those brutal mornings I'd find my 9 old bison down in the seep, bedded around the warm heart of it, breathing steady, their thick coats rimed white with frost, but their bodies warm underneath. And not one of them sick, not one of them down, not one of them lost. Dell drove by more than once that January, and I know he saw them standing dark and healthy in the low ground, while his own cattle huddled in windbreaks, and he didn't say anything, but he slowed down each time, and a certain man, slowing down to look twice, is a certain man beginning to wonder. The bison had found something older than the extension office's maps. Bison wintered on this land before there were maps, before there was a county, before there were men here to be certain about anything, and they wintered by reading the ground for its warm places. And these 9 had that reading in them still, worn out and cast off and unwanted, and they'd brought it onto my 40 and shown it to me like a gift handed down. My grandfather had run bison because he'd figured that out. I'd run cattle my whole life and cursed the seep because I'd forgotten it. It took 9 animals nobody wanted to remind me what the ground was for. The thaw came late that year, not until the middle of March, and I'd made my arrangements by then. I'd called a man named Osgood, who ran a small drilling and excavation outfit, 2 counties over, an old fellow himself, digging ground in this country longer than I'd been farming. The kind of man who'd rather tell you he doesn't know a thing than pretend he does. I'd chosen him over the bigger outfit, closer by on purpose, because I wanted somebody who'd look at the actual ground and not just the number on a work order. He came out on the 20th of March, a Wednesday, with a small track excavator on a trailer, and I walked him out to the seep where the bison had drifted off to the far end of the 40 to graze the first green coming up. And I showed him the open patch, smaller. Now with the thaw, but still there, still dark, and I knelt and put my hand down and told him to do the same. He was quiet a while, that man. He knelt there with his big weathered hand flat against the ground the way I had all winter, and he didn't say anything for a long time, and then he stood up slow and looked out over the whole low ground with a different set to his face than he'd come with. He said he'd dig a probe trench, careful, along the low line, and see what we found. and I want to tell this part slow because it's the part that mattered. He dug maybe 3 hours, careful as a surgeon, working the low ground in a line and at a depth of about 11 feet, right under the center of where those bison had bedded all winter. His bucket came up out of the ground, and the water that ran off it was not cold. It was warm. Not hot, but warm. Warm enough to steam faint in the March air, and Osgood shut his machine off and climbed down into the edge of that trench and cupped that water in his hand and held it. And then he looked up at me, and he was quiet again in that way of his, and then he said one word. He said, "Exceptional." That was all. Exceptional. From a man who'd been drilling and digging ground in this part of the country for 50 years. What we'd found, and what the test confirmed in the weeks after, was a warm spring. A genuine geothermal seep coming up through a fault in the bedrock, holding steady at around 62 degrees year-round, no matter the season, no matter the year. 62 degrees. Coming up out of the ground under my rough 40. Under the piece I'd apologized for and cursed, and lost mower blades too for 40 years. The extension fellow's maps hadn't shown it because it didn't come from the 90-foot water table he'd measured. It came up along a fault he had no way to know about, a narrow warm vein that surfaced in exactly one spot, the spot my grandfather had marked in 1951, and the spot those 9 old bison had walked straight to on their 4th day on my ground. Osgood told me, standing there at that trench, that a reliable 62-degree spring on a working farm was worth more than most men would guess. He said it could water stock through the hardest winter without a heater or a dime of electric, that it could take the freeze off a whole set of tanks with a little gravity plumbing, that in the right hands it could warm a greenhouse or a farrowing barn clean through the cold months. He said he'd dug maybe 4 springs like it in his whole career and never one this steady. And he said the thing that stayed with me. He said, "Your granddad knew, didn't he?" And I said, he knew there was warm water. He just never knew how deep. And Osgood nodded and looked down at 11 feet of dug ground and said, "Well, he knows now." I didn't do much with it that first spring, and I want to say why. Because it's the truest thing I can tell you about what this whole business taught me. I capped it clean, and I ran a simple gravity line off it to a stock tank down in the low ground, a tank that now, going on 5 winters, has never once frozen over, not on the 15 below nights, not ever, and my stock water down there for nothing. No heater, no electric, no worry. The way my grandfather's bison watered it for him 70 years ago, and never told him why. I've since put in a small setup off it, nothing grand, enough to keep a little greenhouse warm through the winter, so Ruth has her greens in February, and I've something to put her at when the ground's too hard to work. Men from the extension office have been out to look at it, the young fellow with the clipboard among them, and he stood at that capped spring with the steam coming up faint on a cold morning, and he didn't have a number for me that day. He just looked at it a long while and said he'd never have found it off the maps, and I told him I hadn't found it off the maps either. 9 old bison found it. I just had the sense, finally, to watch them. Dell came by last winter, the coldest one we've had in years, and he got out of his truck this time. He walked down to the low ground with me and stood at the tank that wouldn't freeze, while his breath smoked and mine did. And he looked at the water, steaming faint and dark against all that white, and he looked at the bison, older now, moving slower, but wintering easy in the warm heart of the 40 like they'd done every year since. And Dell, who is a certain man, and not a cruel one, put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the ground a while, and then he said, "That's not as worthless a piece as I figured." And that was all. He didn't say more, and I didn't need him to. Around here that's a monument. Then he got in his clean truck and drove on. 6 of those 9 cows are still with me as I tell you this. 3 have passed of plain old age, and I buried them up on the rise above the seep, above the warm ground they found for me, which felt like the right place. They were animals nobody wanted. Culls headed for salvage, $300 a head and good riddance. And they came onto my ground with something in them older than any map or any expert or any certainty, the plain ancient sense to read the earth for its warm places. And they handed me a gift my own grandfather had carried half his life and died, not fully knowing. Test. My grandfather wrote how deep with the question mark and circled it and left it for whoever came after, and it turned out whoever came after was an old man and 9 cast-off bison, 68 years late, kneeling in the frost together to finally answer him. 11 feet, 62 degrees. Never freezes where the spring comes up. He was right the whole time. I just had to be still enough and humble enough and old enough to be shown. I think about that a good deal. Now out at that tank on the cold mornings. We spend so much of our lives being certain and being told numbers meant to end a conversation and apologizing for the ground that doesn't do what the easy ground does. And all the while the answer is sitting there under our feet, warm, patient, waiting on somebody to pay attention. The animals paid attention. My grandfather paid attention most of the way. It took me 68 years and 9 old bison to learn the difference between a worthless piece of ground and a piece I simply hadn't listened to yet. The land doesn't care who believes in it. It just keeps its warm places, and every so often it sends something old and unwanted to stand on them and show you where to dig. If you've got your own piece of rough ground, or your own cast-off thing that turned out to know more than you did, I'd be glad to hear about it down in the comments. And if this meant something to you, subscribe and sit with me a while. We move slow out here, but we get there.